Hi, folks. So it sounds like you can't quite hear Vicky, so we're just going to go ahead and get started this morning. Thank you for coming. I want to thank Kaiser Marston Associates for sponsoring this. What we're going to do today is I'm going to, in a sense, walk you through some updates from the last Chabin webinar. But for those of us that are first timers on this for Chabin, I'm going to tell you some of the basics to get started. So here we go. Here's the agenda for today. I'm going to remind you where we've been, talk about equity markets briefly, talk about jobs and what we might see in terms of data going forward. Then I'm going to talk about what we're seeing nationally across the states with the very sparse data we've received thus far in terms of unemployment and also jobs overall. I'm going to talk about a potential outlook for California as we're starting to see the jobs data come in. And then I'm going to talk about manufacturing as a potential opportunity. Last time we did this for Chabin, we talked about tourism. This time I'm going to talk about manufacturing. And then we're going to wrap up and talk about next steps in sort of the slow potential evolution of the economy opening back up. So folks, again, these are the total cases as of last week. This is basically where we started the process in terms of the economy slowing down. This is where we've been the last 7 days as of Monday. And the idea is we're waiting for this curve to flatten out completely before we start to see a true generalization of the lift of the social restrictions. That's critical. So watching these cases and the epidemiology aspects of this crisis have become front and center in terms of the economy opening back up. The stock market actually has recovered a little bit. So what I'm going to show you is I'm going to show you this long view like I have in the other two sessions with Chabin, where you see the two recessions here. You see the bottoming out after the Great Recession at 735 in May 2009. And then this long bull market interrupted in March 2020 by a steep slowdown of growth in equity markets. But then April has actually been positive. The reason why April's been relatively positive is because A, we do expect some lifting of the social restrictions. And second, we've seen so much positive policy come in, analogous to what we saw at the end of the Great Recession. We're expecting a relatively decent recovery period to start once the social restrictions are lifted. Now, I'm going to talk more about that because the duration of the social restrictions have left the economy somewhat in trouble with respect to jobs and potential businesses staying in business. One of the ways we're measuring jobs and what we might see in the unemployment rate is the following. Initial claims for unemployment insurance are usually a precursor for what's going to happen with unemployment. They're not 100% accurate, but they're very, very accurate in their point count. So this is the U.S. movement since 1986, and you can see what happens in terms of the spiking of these data with respect to when the dates of recessions are set. So usually recessions are dated 8-9 months after the recession started, because we needed data to tell us that the recession actually began. Now, you may feel at this point that there's no doubt about a recession coming. I think most people feel that way, but the actual timing of it and the depth of it is still remains to be seen. So you can see in the last 3 recessions, these data spike and then fall, which is going to look a lot like the evolution of unemployment. And that's why we're watching these data very closely. The last 4 weeks have been brutal. We're going to get more data this morning about the US, and then California we'll get more data about California over the weekend. And here's California in contrast. So you can see there's the US over the last basically 34 years. And here is California, again, spiking just now, but the last 3 recessions, you can see that cyclic movement. And the reason why we have this is because we're basically dealing with the tale of 3 policies. We have monetary policy and fiscal policy that have come as positive aspects to try to help the economy with the negative of the social policy. And our supposition is that those other 2 policies will be bigger once the social policies are restricted. And because we're getting to the point where we're seeing those cases starting to flatten, there's a lot of debate about what's going to happen in terms of reopening. And states and counties and cities all over the nation are thinking about how they're going to play this out. So one question I keep getting asked is, well, what are the costs and benefits of making the decision to reopen, especially if you do it maybe a little earlier than everybody else? Well, let's talk about those briefly. In terms of the costs, one of the main things we're worried about is the risk of reinfection and having our health care system overloaded, which is exactly the reason we went into the social restrictions in the first place. So we don't want to have those costs in the short term. The medium term is that we'll see a shutdown again because we get reinfected, or because even there's a small amount of reinfection or the threat of it, we'll go back into shutdown, which will have this sort of strange wobble effect in our economy where we start to build up positive energy. Then we have the second round of restrictions that can easily lead to another round of job losses, another round of business losses, and have this sort of domino effect negatively in our economy. And in the long term, we could do some serious damage if we don't do it right. So part of the cost of reopening is that we want to avoid long-term structural damage in ostensibly providing businesses with no other reason to go out of business if we can help it. So we want to be very cautious not to have that sort of, again, domino effect from job loss to business loss to further job loss. The benefits of doing it are relatively obvious. We get our jobs and our businesses started again. We get tax revenue flowing again to our municipalities. We are sort of betting on no repeat of the virus, which means that we get that momentum started going toward the end of the year and keep on cruising through the end of the year, assuming we don't have a repeat. And then the long term is that we're going to have a lot of incentives for adaptation in the sense of our businesses are going to adapt to a new social environment, and there's going to be some innovation that's going to come around. And in sort of a classic economic situation, we have this huge cost, and then there's benefits that come as an opportunity on the other side, where we're going to see some entrepreneurism around the way we wear masks, the way we wear gloves, potentially the way that we cleanse our workplaces, in our restaurants, in our retail establishments. It'll be very intriguing to see how many new businesses are born on the other side of this across a lot of different sectors, because it usually happens when you have major crisis, you have innovation and entrepreneurship. So those are good things to think about going forward. I keep saying this, folks, it's the depth and the duration together. So we assume that we're going to have relatively high unemployment rates reported for April. March, as I'll show you in a minute, just started the process because the counts in March end on March 12, or about the middle of the month, generally speaking. So you don't get all the effects that happen in March as the weekly unemployment insurance claims that are new started to spring up in volume, as I showed you in the graph previously. Here's a way of looking at it nationally. So these are the unemployment rates in March, and the darker blue are the states that have higher unemployment rates. You can see Nevada increased quite a bit, or you can't really tell the increase here, but is relatively high unemployment vis-a-vis other states, where a lot of the less populated states have not seen as much of a change in unemployment rates, which means they have not had as many unemployment insurance claims that are new. Now, that's just sort of setting the table of where we are. Notice the highest number on this graph, if you look at the little box, is 6.9%. Now, we're expecting somewhere in the high teens in April, meaning that a lot of these states are going to end up in the 15, 17, 19% range, believe it or not, based on what we're seeing in new unemployment insurance claims. It's actually more telling, the change from 1 month to another, or potentially 1 year to another, and that's what I'm going to show you next by state. So here we go. This is the change from February to March. Again, the darker blue or the darker colors means that there was a more extreme change. But notice in the little box that the maximum change that happened, and this was in Nevada, was 2.7%. So if you went from, let's say, 4.1% unemployment to 6.8% unemployment, that's 2.7, or let's say 27 basis points change up. I didn't say that right, I'm sorry. With 2.7 percentage points up to 6.8. So that's a relatively quick change in 1 month, but the point is that the darker states are the ones that had more unemployment change in 1 month. And 1 month is not really a trend. So what economists usually do is they don't look at 1 month to the next. They think either what's the trend look like, which because this is such a shock, it's hard to say that the last 3 years were building up to this, because they certainly were not. But looking at what happened 1 year ago can be telling, because it takes the seasonality out of moving from 1 month to the next, which may have some seasonal effects inside of it. So this is what it looks like from March to March. And now let me go back to the last graph and take a quick mental picture of this. Notice there's a lot of light states here where the change was relatively small. Now looking from March, we actually see more darker colored states, which means that the jump was a little bit bigger in some of these other states, and that there's a little bit more exposure. Even though there wasn't as large a jump from 1 month to the next, from 1 year to the next, we're starting to see the climbing. So when we do this again, sometime in May, hopefully after we have the new unemployment data for April, we're going to see some wild changes in these maps. And the reason I'm showing you this is because if you don't live in California, this kind of gives you a relative feel of your state and where, in fact, it's lying nationally with respect to changes in unemployment. And that's something we're watching very closely, because that's really where the fruit of this problem in terms of leading to deep recession and a long duration are going to come. Now, I'm going to give you two scenarios for the California economy, because most of the people on this call are probably from California, but California may also be the trendsetter for the national economy, which has been true in the past. It usually is the one that drags us into the downturn nationally if, in fact, California slides relatively quickly. And it's also one of the states, one of the main states that pulls the national economy out. I initially was doing 3 scenarios, a good one, a tricky one, and an ugly one. But because we've been under social restriction longer than I expected, I'm actually moving now to looking at the so-called tricky scenario and the ugly scenario, where the probability of having somewhere maybe in between is relatively high and maybe closer to the tricky. But here's the story. We have now employed similar restrictions that China did when it saw the issue generalize itself in China, which means we've had relatively hard social restrictions. We're all feeling the pain of that. If this turns quickly and we get some momentum in the economy going through the third quarter, then the duration of the episode should be relatively short. And that's critical if the policies that we put in place, the fiscal and monetary policies, are going to work well. We should see some fruit on that by the end of the year. And if the social restrictions lead to some innovations and some other pieces that really help businesses get started again and stabilize, then the duration of this episode should be relatively short, vis-a-vis historic quick downturns where the depth of it was relatively deep. So that's the tricky scenario, and I'll show you that in a minute. The ugly scenario has 2 major aspects to it. One is that we don't start easily. We don't start well, meaning that there's sort of the slow stumble out of the gate where businesses start slowly, people are underconfident in terms of consumption, businesses are underconfident in terms of rehiring and expanding, which then can slow the recovery period and elongate the duration of the episode. We also, in this ugly scenario, have the threat of a repeat. And that's critical because in states like California and more urbanized states in the United States, the threat of a repeat having a general shutdown round 2 is still relatively high. We need a vaccine to show up, which we're hearing from a lot of epidemiologists and a lot of disease experts that we don't expect a vaccine before the end of the year and maybe not in mass until early next year, which means we could have another episode. And you're hearing a lot of hypotheses running around in the news about this. Even in the White House is starting to make broad claims about what's going to happen or not. So if we have a second episode, then we're going to go right back into this shutdown situation, probably sometime in the winter. But if that happens, since we're already used to it, we might see some adjustments that might keep a second round from not being as deep. And I'll show you that in terms of the way I'm forecasting this in the data. But those are the kind of things we're watching in terms of what the scenarios may be. And then that, in a sense, tells us when we might get back to what we think of as the baseline. So for California, here's the story. That's the baseline forecast from the Department of Finance. And the Department of Finance is currently in California revising its forecast to be one of these other scenarios. But this is where we started the year, which is good to remember because we had momentum going into this year economically. So the baseline is not completely corrupt in terms of a forecast because of what's happened. It tells you where we were. And in a sense, gives us a goal structure to get back. So here is the tricky scenario. And here is the ugly scenario. Now notice the tricky scenario, the blue, moves up, and I'm hoping you can see my cursor here, moves up and does not get back to the baseline. And this is why the baseline forecast is important until sometime in early 2022. Now, you may argue that 2021 is more likely or that we're going to have more of a V-shaped forecast. Because we've been in social restrictions for so long and we don't know the full fruit of the labor market data yet, I'm assuming that we're going to have a really sharp decline in jobs coming into April and May, which will linger over time. And notice there's not much time where the sharp decline happens in either scenario. But notice again, like I just said before, in the ugly scenario, we have a double dip, meaning that we go into another round of restrictions, which likely means either more job losses or a longer period at the initial decline, which then takes a longer time period to get back to the baseline, maybe sometime in 2023. But given how much policy positivity there's going to be once businesses reopen between fiscal and monetary, historically speaking, we do see recovery speed up with that much momentum from policy. Whether or not the economy and social restrictions allows us to utilize those policies is really the open question. And here are the most recent recessions to consider. And here is the Great Recession in terms of the dip. Notice it was a more elongated in time in terms of how we went down. It's not as sharp a decline as we're expecting in this episode. And it also had a longer recovery period. So we're expecting this to be a shorter duration than the Great Recession for most cities and counties in California, but we're also expecting the decline to be more sharp. Now, if we have that ugly scenario, we're basically moving our jobs levels back 5 years in time, which sounds like a very ugly scenario. But if you look at the Great Recession, we move back almost 10 years in time with those job losses. So we're hoping all the policy movements actually provide some support to not trough as low as we did in the Great Recession. Well, what do we need to do? Well, last time I talked about tourism. Now I'm going to talk about manufacturing and thinking about what opportunities are out there for cities and counties all over the United States. health system supply chains might have some federal positivity coming on the other side of this, and that the federal government may be worried about how another episode leaves us somewhat vulnerable to not having the right supplies, not having the right medicine, not having the right array of health system supply chain needs. And we want to manufacture those in the United States predominantly. So we might have a lot of federal incentives for economic development personnel to say, okay, great. If you give me the money, I can go out and find the businesses or find the entrepreneurs that want to start manufacturing locally and utilize those federal dollars to provide a multiplier effect in my community and ultimately provide all kinds of economic incentives for that to continue. Pharmaceutical manufacturing is part of that too. And so we should expect that we're going to have some federal incentives to increase manufacturing in pharma all over the place, especially where life sciences already has a pretty good foothold because the workforce is there, potentially the facilities are there. And for facilities that are currently lying fallow, that you may have had a relatively large pharmaceutical firm move or switch locations and leave lab space and manufacturing space in their wake, this might be a time to reinvigorate those spaces. Agricultural supply chain, also same thing. We want to have food here in the United States. We're not worried about having shortages or anything that where the population is vulnerable. That has not really happened in this episode just yet. It might feel that way because if you went to the grocery store, some of the things were not on the shelves anymore. A lot of that was more logistics than actual manufacturing or production. So we might see all parts of the supply chain on agriculture get a boost from the federal and state governments simply to make sure that those things flow if, in fact, we have a repeat more cleanly. We might see an enhancement of enterprise zones and CDBG grants in the sense of seeing underdeveloped places in the United States get more of a boost and have, let's say, a larger incentive for manufacturing and the things above to locate in those zones. So watch for that from the federal government and think about what your local area can do along these lines. If you're an economic development professional, this is a really good time to be planning, both for how to help support tourism, which is going to be hurting for some time, but also take advantage of manufacturing incentives and think about, well, I've got this commercial space that's industrial that's still lying fallow. Is there something I can do, or is there federal money I can utilize to reinvigorate this space and help our communities generally? So to wrap up, folks, we're watching the labor market. This is the number one thing. The data should be coming out here very soon this morning on the new unemployment insurance claims from last week in the US, which will probably find another 4 or 5 million people. Which will take us up into the mid-20s in terms of millions of people that have now sought unemployment insurance in the last 5 weeks. The latest data were 22 million in 4 weeks and about 2.8 million in California. So we're seeing unemployment projections in the high teens for April at this stage. And we're watching both the unemployed but also the employed. How many people are losing their jobs and in what industries? Because in those industries that are losing jobs quickly, it suggests a longer turnaround time. For example, in hospitality and personal services, where we've seen most of the losses initially in March, which means those were the first in and maybe the last out. Average hours is something we're also watching. Are we seeing a shift in the way we're doing work where businesses are staying open but asking their workers to work fewer hours and potentially combine those fewer hours with unemployment insurance benefits that have been enhanced? We're watching the cases. The epidemiology is still the number one thing in the news every day, and we can also get very caught up in the science of it all. Bottom line is we need that hill to get climbed, and we need to start moving on the other side, which is then going to start dictating the depth and the duration of the episode. And then finally, we're watching how policy evolves. We're watching some unrest in our urban areas. This is going to put further pressure on governors, county boards of supervisors, city councils, and mayors to start lifting restrictions and allow people to get out of their house. So you're probably going to have a lot of discussions or hear about them in your local municipality over the next 10 days about reopening parks, reopening golf courses, reopening hair salons, nail salons, places where you can take on some simple social distancing restrictions, physical distancing restrictions in such a way you can get business started again, or at least get out of the house, and allows some pressure relief in terms of potential social unrest. The social unrest, if it sparks up, can easily lead to more municipal costs at a time where municipal revenues are going to be a big question. So with that, I'm going to hand it out to Vicki to ask me some questions. Vicki, I'm hoping that you can hear me and that you have an ability to communicate with me. Please let me know if you hear me.
Hey, Rob, okay.
I hear you.
I did hear you. All right, great. Okay, first question. I just saw that Americans filed 4.4 million jobless claims last week. I don't know if there's more to the question, but is there, can you address that?
Yeah, so in my last slide, I talked about 22 million over 4 weeks. It's correct that 4.4 were last week, and we're probably going to see another around 5 million this week. We will find out here later today. I haven't seen the data yet this morning, but that is correct.
Okay. How does small business payroll grants affect recovery? Businesses are bringing back at least 75% of staff. Tourism and hospitality is among these.
It's very tough. The supposition is that every business is going to be a little different in how people come back. So one of the things we don't know is what costs business will face on top of continuing to have employees on the other side of the space on what public health tells us we need to have in our places of work, and what that really means in terms of potential demand and workspace needs. So for example, if I used to have, let's say, one person every 20 square feet, am I now going to be looking at one person every 40 square feet, which means I don't have to retain as many people regardless of the demand conditions. So it's going to be very intriguing, especially in restaurants, where we naturally gather together in the restaurant model is to try to have as many turns on the tables and potentially have as many tables in the space that commercial zoning allows, how that's going to change the business model for a lot of different industries.
Okay. In the past, have you seen, or which have you seen come first, the business manufacturing confidence or consumer confidence?
That's a great question. Consumer confidence usually provides manufacturing with the incentives to expand and remain more confident. And in the data, they're very closely aligned with each other because they're watching each other. Why? If you look at manufacturing in terms of a jobs generator, if manufacturing takes a quick dip, that might reduce consumer confidence. And if consumer confidence takes a quick dip, manufacturing might have a loss of confidence. And the two somewhat feed off of each other historically when the United States was more of a manufacturing center. Now we watch both manufacturing confidence and general services business confidence together to really get a gauge of where they're seeing the future, and that can feed worker and consumer expectations on the other side. None of them are really causal of each other. They're very much walk hand in hand.
Great. Right, that addresses all of our questions. You must have covered everything very well, Rob.
Wow.
So I would thank everyone again for listening in, and we will have the recording up on our website. And thank you again to EFA, Sonoma State, Kaiser Marston, and Chabon, and we will talk with you again in about 9 or 10 days. Thank you.
Thanks, Vicki. And folks, if you have any questions, be sure to email me or hit me on my Twitter at that handle right there on this last slide. And I want to thank Kaiser Marston and Chabon again, too. Thank you.